So we're going to get through the meat and potatoes of it. So if you're not familiar with Wilger, literally that's factory there. We've been there, well, we've been manufacturing since '76. Used to build big spurs. Where here's pretty much, okay, well this is from like Agri-Auto. But yeah, we're right there. So we're as local as she gets. So we're physically manufacturing the nozzles, nozzle bodies, simple stuff, complex stuff, primarily for Case IH or type of manufacturers, but or we do liquid fertilizer monitoring. So even though liquid fertilizer is not crazy heavily used in Saskatchewan here, there's pockets of it that if you do need blockage on planters and drills and those kind of things, we have both mechanical and then electronic versions as well that you can get through Agri-Auto parts there. So just so you're aware of that stuff. The flow indicator is very simple concept. Ball goes up if you got too much flow. Ball goes down relative to the other ones if you got plug. So I won't spend much time. We're talking spraying today. So for the nozzles, we have a few. Sorry, I'm going to stop talking while I'm moving just in case that happens again. A few references for you guys. So you got the catalogs there that'll have all the tip charts, all that kind of stuff. There's some kind of easier reading guides just to kind of walk you through how to pick spray tips, things to consider, things to kind of ignore, and those kind of things. There's also on your table just a few of them. I kind of thought of it last minute, kind of a photocopied kind of cheat sheets, just as far as picking nozzles. This is more for the guys that are using the pulse width modulated sprayer. How many guys here, so who's not using pulse width? Who's just using rate control sprayer? Hands up. So, okay, so a handful. Okay, sweet. So with the pulse width, again, the nozzles change a fair bit, especially if you're your first time using a pulsar sprayer. Definitely worthwhile to have this guy, because it saves a whole lot of grief just as far as picking those nozzles the first time around. But when it comes down to it, another resource that's kind of useful for you too, I just picked mine up there, just in Regina there yesterday. A lot of the nozzle information and kind of the spray quality stuff that is usually the stuff that's missing as far as information. She's going to be in your chem label. So again, this is just the updated crop production guide. They just, I guess, print it off, so you can probably pick it up in the office on the way out of town here too, just actually by like literally across the street from Agri-Auto. Yeah, it's definitely a good resource because again, this fills in a lot of the gaps, just as far as the nozzle specific stuff. So I was talking to the government folks here yesterday, and yes, they were going to be doing some seminars, kind of, hey, breaking down the chemical label, breaking down the, kind of how to read it, if that makes sense. Because again, that's sometimes missing information. That's pretty darn critical. Because again, with spraying, we generally get one shot, if that makes sense. We've got to make it work. So back to the nozzles. So Wilger manufactures 5 different series. 5 different series of nozzles, and the main difference is for each flow rate, so again for each color, because again color is the same whether it's a T-jet nozzle, Wilger nozzle, or whoever. For each nozzle size, we have 5 different series. So think of it like a sliding scale of droplet size. So from coarser, or the finest, and then coarser, and then coarser, coarser, you get to the crazy, crazy coarse, where we don't want to use that probably in Saskatchewan unless you're doing crazy stuff. Does that make sense? So the main purpose is not that you buy one of each and then, I can retire on a nice farm, that kind of stuff. The purpose is that you can get that sweet spot wherever it makes sense for your application. Because again, we here in Saskatchewan, Saskatoon, are going to have very different spray challenges and know what we got to hit than the guys in Ontario. Again, they've got veggie guys, organics, RMs every 10 feet, those kind of things. They're going to be a lot more drift resistant or drift sensitive than us. So again, that means we can usually, for what we're spraying, it's usually between the SR and the MR series of our nozzles, just because it reduces drift, but not like crazy. We're not chunking out our coverage really hard by using those nozzles. So, so that's kind of just visual. I'm going to skip through this stuff a little bit, again, just as far as what those nozzle coverage patterns got to look like there. This is more just a video. Again, this is for an 015 nozzle, but we get to the point where the ER series, in this nozzle, what you're seeing is about 52% of your spray being drift, or driftable fines. And then usually the thing is when we're talking nozzles, the difficulty is it's very easy to focus on drift, or drift reduction, if that makes sense. But what ends up happening, you got to remember though, it's balancing act. We get to the point where it's both drift and coverage that we have to watch out for. A lot of the time, sometimes, especially after the first time you get a drift complaint or an issue or whatever because something drifted over, that makes bad feelings, naturally. That makes sense. So sometimes you guys get a little bit of a knee-jerk reaction and say, hey, I don't want drift anymore. Like I want zero drift. That makes sense. And you pick a nozzle that, yeah, you get that 1.5%, 2% drift, like pretty much zero drift. But what happens, you tanked your drift, what happens to that coverage? She went along for the ride. That makes sense. So we got to balance those two. So with our nozzle side of things, again, depending on what series we're using, we're going to get that kind of different level, and that's where those cheat codes that I have on the charts there and that kind of stuff, that'll help you along. That makes sense. This is just another way to visualize, because again, everybody takes in information different ways. So this is, for an example, an SR106. This is literally what it does. All these different lines, these are different droplet size. So itty bitty little droplet size are really fine stuff. Like 100 microns or smaller, that's those driftable fines. That's the stuff that's not going where you want it to go. Either because it evaporated, moved off target. Again, whether it moved off target 5 feet or 50 feet or 500 feet, kind of doesn't matter. It's not going where you want it to go, so we can't trust it to be covered, is what it comes down to. So, and then on the flip side, so all this stuff that's coarser, those really big droplets, so those are the big lumpy ones. The hits that leaf rolls off and does nothing for you. It hits the ground, put it that way, because it rolled off. You're not going to get it to stick on the plant. She's too big. So we want to minimize that stuff. So we get to the point where, yeah, we want pretty much the good stuff in the middle, if that makes sense. The stuff that's not too coarse, not too drifty. That makes sense? Another visual, again, this just takes the numbers out of and that kind of stuff, but this is most nozzles are going to be making a bell curve. So we get to the point where, yeah, we get, drifting fines, those kind of things. We want to minimize those, but we don't want to get too coarse. So yeah, we kind of use that droplet size or that targeted droplet size to kind of pretty much get to the point where you can target stuff better. And the reason we do that, I'll skip ahead here. The reason we do that is if you're following the chemical label, generally, like glyphosate, you'd be reading something along the lines of the chemical label says, hey, spray with the droplet size that's the ASABE, so that's just the certification of it, coarse droplet or coarser. And usually that's the key stuff. That's the meat and potatoes there in the chemical label. The difficulty is though, when you're talking coarse is category, well, big. So yeah, that's naturally, so just like on this chart. So just to give you 2 seconds here. So you remember that driftable part? Well, we give that to you. We give that to you in a percentage. So that's this first column, not less than 141. So that's the percent of your spray that's going to be driftable fines. Again, this is nice information because, first of all, you can figure out what your nozzle is going to look like before you actually buy it. Because I'm not happy if you buy a nozzle, you try it, like, oh, that's not what I wanted. And I'm sitting there laughing because you bought a nozzle, now you can buy another. No. We want to make sure you get it right the first time. So the first column, that's your driftable fines. And then the last column, that's the percent of your small droplets. Because again, we want to have lots of that spray to be nice and small. So that's your balancing act. So you get to the point where, yeah, in this situation, and kind of the point I was getting at is that coarse as a category, it's big. Where's our drift at? So on the finer side of things, and this is kind of a fairly big nozzle, but you'd be on the lower side of drift is about 12% spray. So 12% of your spray is going to be taken off. That makes sense. Pretty much written off before we start. This is kind of the easiest way to think of it. But we're still, of course, up here. On the higher side of things, we're about 20% drift. We've doubled our drift. So when the chemical label side of things, when you're picking your ideal nozzle with the information given to you, well, you still don't know where you are or where you're intended to be. If that makes sense. So what we end up doing, we actually get you to the point where we give you droplet size. Once you're used to using the droplet size a little bit, you can get to the point where instead of just looking for that huge category range of course, we can say, hey, for glyphosate, kind of like in the little cheat codes there. So a little Xerox thing there, so it'll say, hey, you know what? Here's Lucas's rule of thumb. Oh, too much. Yeah. So for like glyphosate, what we can end up doing is say, hey, instead of looking for coarse, search around 400 microns. So that droplet size, and then we kind of get that sweet spot right away. We don't have to filter through the 50 different nozzles that we can use and all the different, those kind of things. But when we come to something like glufosinate or Liberty or applications that are contact oriented, burning chem, we get to the point where, well, do we do better coverage than we do in burn off? Yeah, we do. So that balancing act, where it comes down to, it shifts. That makes sense. So the droplet size changes, so we might be looking around 330 microns as a sweet spot. That's kind of my favorite number there. Same for fungicides. Fungicides, there's less drift, right? Or less drift sensitivity. Because again, unless the neighbor's growing mushrooms or something, it's probably fine. That makes sense. But even for fungicide, we get to the point where fungicide, that's probably one of the most expensive chem regimens that you spray. And it's got to work. And it's on label for suppression, which means you got stuff stacked against even more. So you get to the point where, yeah, we don't want drift, but or drift is fine rather, but we don't want to be wasting chem either. We don't need evaporating before any actives make contact and do what they need to do. So yeah, we get to that point. And then for desiccation, same idea. Desiccation, usually they want upper water volumes and those kind of things, but we still need coverage as well. So somewhere kind of in between, depending on the product, whether you're using glyphosate or Revlon or those kind of things. So on that same kind of balancing act, so I gave you droplet size as for example. But if we're talking, that balancing act I was showing you before, if we're talking a systemic herbicide, we want to try and keep our driftable fines generally under 10%. That's kind of where my sweet spot is. Again, for Western Canadian spraying, out east and those kind of things, because if they're more drift sensitive, they're going to shift their balancing act a little bit to chase a little bit more drift control. And then for coverage side of things, and that other side of the balancing act, usually we want to try and maintain at least 80% of our spray be nice and small. And the reason that between that is, hey, glyphosate, we have systemic action, translocation, where we don't need all the bitty little droplets on the plant. That makes sense. We want to hit. And then for glyphosate or glufosinate, so Liberty or other applications, whether it's wild oat control or grassy controls and those kind of things, generally that shifts a little bit. Well, the mode of action changed naturally, but the main thing is we need coverage now. Because we're willing to accept a little bit more drift, but usually, Liberty's not as nasty. You get a little bit of drift over here, it's going to make it unhappy, but it's not going to nuke it, generally. But you get to the point where if we're accepting a little bit more drift, we better demand better coverage, if that makes sense. So drift we might keep under 15%, but our coverage factor we want to increase upwards of 90%. And so for fungicide, kind of the same deal. Again, even though drift isn't a concern as far as the crop damage, we still want it to work. Because again, there's benefit to having that balancing act kind of keyed in. So, but yeah. To make it all easier, because you're probably already overwhelmed if it's the first time you've seen some of this information, Tip Wizard makes it a whole lot easier. Tip Wizard, our spray tip calculator app and all that kind of stuff on the website. Generally, you plug in application rate, you got to know that. Application speed, you got to know that. Application spacing, you better know that on what your sprayer doing. And you get to the point where you get those charts. You get it just tapered down rather than having to read it through and cross-reference the charts, which is sometimes overwhelming. That hey, you've had 8 months to forget about that, how to read the charts. Now, guess what? Shoot, spraying time. I got to spray tomorrow. Okay, what am I doing? If that sounds familiar, Tip Wizard at least takes the chart side out of it. So you just plug in the application. So I'll go through kind of a sample tip application here, just in a smidge. But I wanted to show you some other tech stuff or changing of how we're spraying to kind of get that low-hanging fruit when we're talking other applications. That's a little bit maybe less common out in this neck of the woods, but still pretty important. Oh, actually, this was a little tidbit I threw in here too. Just more of a public service announcement. Not that what's better than telling us as trainers to clean them. Pretty much anything. So this was, again, just when you're talking strainers, build up and those kind of things, again, especially because we're sitting through the winter and that kind of stuff cakes off, hard water, all those different things. This was actually just kind of a nasty batch of pieces. So insecticide, I just kind of, if you can't see it, that orifice, the actual spray tip, just decided to crystallize hard. Brand new tips, crystallize hard, just because. So a guy came in and said, hey, your tip's running half the flow. I'm like, well, no, it shouldn't be, it's brand new. Anyways, but yeah, then we looked at it, and yes, clear enough, she's shrunk in. So we do have an ultrasonic cleaner at the factory here. They're pretty cheap, like they're probably 150, 200 bucks depending, or 250. Honestly, maybe one of those things Janine's got to bring into the show for pre-spraying season. But you get to the point where you toss it in the bucket. Literally toss it in the bucket, a little bit of water, soap, toss the nozzles in. We don't have to scrub a bloody thing. Come back 4 hours later, and I just did 4 hours in this situation because I had a guy with a thesis there and that. And they're brand new. So any of those strainers especially, rather than having to try that stuff, because sometimes if you don't get all the crystallization, well guess what, it's going to just crystallize, it builds. Or that kind of stuff, it just builds. So anyways, nothing to do with the nozzles, it's just more of a, hey, help yourself out, make it a little bit easier. Yeah. Another thing just to be aware, anybody doing spot spraying this next year? Spot spraying as far as my impact, because again, usually, especially the tech side of things, given how it would cost and those kind of things, I'm actually seeing a lot of guys picking it up, which has actually been surprising, because I figured it's a 5-year thing where guys start picking up. But I'm pretty surprised. But we did make a new series of nozzle for the narrow angle stuff, just so you're aware of it. So that's the X series. Again, this is probably one of the most extreme cases. This isn't throwing flack at a competitor nozzle by any means, but for pulse width, if you're using pulse width, we don't want to use it because it interrupts with the air induction function, physically how the air induction functions. Again, this is probably one of the worst cases because of how it's designed, but generally you want to avoid that. And then angle spraying. So angle spraying a lot of the time becomes a little bit of a fad, to do this and that for everything because 2 angles are better than 1, those kind of things come through our head. The difficulty is, depending on the sprayer speed and the boom heights that we're keeping at, a lot of the time we're actually shooting ourselves in the foot a fair bit, what it comes down to. Just because well, and I'll kind of walk through here too, but these are just some of the angle nozzle adapters. So the 30-degree single is a new one, primarily for the spot spray guys. I'll skip over that stuff. 30-50 is kind of a new one. If anybody have a Case IH sprayer, like a 50 series, one of the newer ones? Oh, good. Yeah, otherwise we have a 30-50 angle or a 30-30. It's kind of what it comes down to. Skip over that there. So for the angle spraying again, if we're doing it, generally there's times to do it, and times that are super pays off and those kind of things. If we're going to be doing a nozzle setup like that, you know, usually the bigger nozzle forward, a little bit coarser, because what ends up happening, you know, probably even skip some of this stuff, but if we're talking like headlight, they're straight up upper. You know, we're getting to the point where like 15% better drop the deposition. So how many guys are doing fuse or headlight spraying? Again, depending on the year, who knows, we got moisture this year, maybe we'll see moisture and we'll be doing it. But it is a useful way. The adapter, the other thing too is that, hey, if you have a 5-gallon tip for burn off and a 10-gallon tip for in crop, buy the adapter and you're set up for those odd years. So you got to spray 15-gallon plus. If that makes sense. So again, you've got options there for the adapters that kind of make nozzles that don't exist otherwise. Just got to be aware of them. This is just more of a visual. So when I'm talking about, you know, the downsides, or sometimes guys get kind of stuck with the angled nozzles thinking they're the best for everything. The difficulty is the more aggressive the angle is, the further that spray has to travel. If that makes sense. So let's say boom hits right here. Let's say we're just, you can see it. Hey, if we're spraying straight down, well, different droplet size, they can only go so far. So kind of like you see in this graph here, hey, you know what? The red stuff, that's where those fine sprays are stopping, you know, the drift stuff, because she's small. Just like a pressure wash, you got 3,000 PSI spraying, she's not going 400 feet. No, everything hits a wall at different stages. The finer the spray, the sooner it hits the wall. So similar to that, the difficulty is when we're talking spray angle, what we're kind of spraying, our good droplets of medium core stuff, that gives the bulk of our coverage. That stuff goes like 14, 16 inches, and then she's hit that wall. Not a big deal when your boom's, you know, 24, 26, 30 inches, because you're pretty much where you want it to go. But the difficulty is what happens when you angle. Well, you get about, it's about 60-degree angle where it doubles. So even if we're saying 60 or 50 or all that kind of stuff, get to the point where, okay, well, we're at this height, we've changed the angle there, how far is that spray gotta go? How far is that medium core stuff, the stuff that we're relying on for that coverage going? It's going the same distance. If not a little worse, but you get a little bit more shear and those kind of things. So for headlight, where we're talking a very vertical growing target, we got, usually we're in the same boat here, but more in the south, there's different growing stuff that they'll do this stuff for. But if we're talking wheat, we want all the spray to be flag leafing up. So is it a bad thing to have all the chem hang up at the top of the canopy? No, that's perfect. Canola, maybe not as much. If we're talking peas, lentils, those kind of things, we need that penetration. So that's where that angle, if we have wind cutting in the right way, and there's a lot of the stuff, and even a lot of the stuff that I'm kind of covering that, it's more generalized. Because again, I can't expect everybody to be, you know, that premium operator that spends, you know, the entire summer in the sprayer and those kind of things, that you pick up tricks. You're watching wind patterns, you're watching this, you're able to come up and do your middles and then come back for your boundaries when the wind's cutting in the right way, those kind of things. That makes a big difference. So don't discount that, but also don't think that all angle tips are bad and those kind of things, because it gets to the point where, yeah, if you can keep your boom low and you're offsetting a lot of that distant stuff and you're keeping there or you're going slower, those kind of things, yeah, you can make it work. And a lot of the nozzles for those angle setups are, you know, designed in Europe and those kind of things where they're going 12 kilometers now, max, if that makes sense. So different world, is kind of what it comes down to. So, but anyways, for the angled setups, that's kind of what we're looking at. The other alternative though is the double down. So when we're talking, well, what's the bad stuff that happens with angles? It's not because we're splitting up two tips into two tips, or, you know, one tip instead of one tip into two tips. As long as the tip's big enough that you're not using two itty bitty little guys. No, a lot of the issue is just the angle, because increasing, you know, or decreasing our consistency, put it that way. Otherwise, the double down and the double down burger, I missed it. But anyways, got distracted there. So with the double down nozzle, we can get to the same benefit where if we're getting to those higher rate applications where a single tip is starting to get too coarse too quick, that makes sense. And more in those applications, I'm talking more if you're going 10 gallons an acre at relatively 15 plus mile an hour speed. Some of you might be, a lot of you might not be, if that makes sense. Once we get up to those higher flow rates, especially that 15, 20 gallon work, if you're doing regular and those kind of things, you get to the point where, yeah, one tip, it starts to get too coarse. Even if we're using the finest series, like our ER series, so like the finest as it gets in the world, she's still too coarse. And you're like, well, geez, what am I doing wrong? Does that make sense? So the double down is kind of the solution to that. So we can split it into 2 more meaningful tips, and we can do a lot of good stuff. Does that make sense? So we get to the point where, yeah, you can get borderline. I think we had a little bit of chart to this. So yeah, so pretty much though, the main thing is it's for high flow applications. Are we doing double down for burn off 5 gallons an acre? No, not worth it. If we have a single nozzle that's doing what we need it to do, don't change it. Don't buy extra nozzles just because, or those kind of things. It gets to the point where, no, you can do a really proper job. It's just once we get to the high flow rate applications that we're starting garden hose. That makes sense. And the double down, yeah. Actually really tasty to eat like a full meal. Anyways. When we're talking double down spraying, generally, kind of like I already talked, headlight and those kind of things where we want all that spray to hang up on the top of the canopy. The angle works pretty well. But anything canopy related or high volume, yeah, this is just kind of a, hey, what's wrong with a single nozzle, large nozzle, meaning it gets coarser, drift reduction tech thrown into that, and it gets coarser, and then for the guys running the pulse width systems, you get a little bit of pressure drop through the system there too, which means it gets coarser. So everything kind of compounds and makes a really, really coarse nozzle, which is the opposite of what we want for fungus investigation. So, yep, so this was just as a rough idea, so I'll show you a little bit clearer on the tip wizard out here too. But this is just kind of what a tip wizard result would look like. So if I said, hey, I want to do 20 gallons an acre, 15 mile an hour for fungicide. Again, like I said, might not be a ton of you guys here today, but just for visual, at 60 PSI, we can travel upwards of 20 mile an hour on a pulsing sprayer. That's just the sprayer doing its thing. But we get to the point where here's our drift factor and here's our coverage factor. So we see our drift factor is reasonable at 11%. Hey, I'm happy with that. But when we're talking for fungicide, we're aiming for like 90% coverage or more. This is the ER series. So again, finest tip that's available in that size. We're only hitting 74%, so we're hitting pretty low. That makes sense. So that's where we say, hey, can we do it any different? Just to visualize it a different way, you can say, hey, 74% of my spray, that's the fine stuff, the good stuff, if that makes sense. But that still includes the drift, so we can actually take the drift out to make it easier. Because again, nobody likes math, but it is useful in this case in that we can say 74% of our spray is nice and small, but we're going to take away the drift part. So what are we left with? That stuff in the middle, that mid-bell curve, the stuff, the sweet spot. So only 63% of the stuff is good. Comparing it to 206 tips, doing the same application, 20 gallons an acre, 15 mile an hour, we can keep our drift at 9%, so even lower drift, actually, because again, it's drift reduction tech built the nozzle on a smaller nozzle, and we can keep our coverage factor at 89%, so like right at the 90%. We're like, oh, that's a pretty slick deal, and it is, that's why it is. Do the same math, what are we talking, 90% small stuff, take away the drift, and we're left with 80%, compared to that 63% that we did before. That's a huge improvement. Huge improvement, because again, if you're getting the spray out, let's make it work. That makes sense. Because nothing worse than, hey, I put on my 20 gallons, check mark. Did they do a good job? Well, no, the check mark's just to say I did 20 gallons an acre. I don't know how I did. Usually it's too late by the time you did that, or too late by the time you know how you did. So I'll go to the temperature here, but just as a rough idea, again, through Agri-Auto, the guru there, they'll touch base with me all the time. I'm in there frequently, so it's been times where literally I'm walking in like a sitcom, and there's somebody struggling with spray tip stuff at the desk. I'm like, oh, well, do I have to? Okay, we'll go. And then I'll easy, very easy to talk to there. So again, if you have questions specifically, those kind of things that I didn't cover or anything like that, by all means reach out. Ask me the Agri-Auto team again, like this. Every year I've been having, probably every year together. Yeah, a lot of their crew will have it. We'll bring them into the factory there, do some training and that kind of stuff, get a little bit more in depth every time, which is good. That's better for you guys, if that makes sense. So I'll go into temperature here. Hopefully my mic doesn't kill you guys. Otherwise I'll turn it off. So far so good. All right, so you'll see my back here, but so Tip Wizard, so this is just on the website. So just wilger.net. If you haven't seen it, it is really handy. Just on the website, there we go. If you scroll down, there are little articles, this and that, and video guides of tip selection processes and those kind of things there too. But we'll be going on to Tip Wizard. We do have a new version of Tip Wizard coming up here right away. Hopefully that's probably pretty decent for you guys. The new version of Tip Wizard has a few different changes. So usually we'd be doing broadcast spraying. So broadcast spraying, that's with overlap and swath and those kind of things. We do have double down spraying. Double down, so that's just to make it easier to pick those two tip combinations, if that makes sense. We have band spraying, less common up here, but that's more for the guys that aren't broadcast, they're not overlapping, they're spraying between rolls and those. But spot spray, again, that might hit you in the future, who knows? But again, we got a separate tip pusher for that too. So we'll do just kind of what we'd be typically doing in the spring here. So how about we do that? So we scroll down a little bit, we pick our units. Oh, yeah, thanks. Oh, yeah. Must be getting old that he's offering me chairs, jeez. Yeah, we pick our units. So even if you're one of the guys that are still using US or imperial gallons an acre, and you haven't seen an imperial gallon an acre chart, and you got to buy it on eBay for $200, 200 accounts for that. So no big deal. You just pick imperial gallons an acre. But generally, most of you are going to be doing US gallons an acre. We'd select whether you're doing a rate control sprayer system or pulse width modulation. Again, if you ever forget or need to double check or want to read a little bit more, there's little light bulb figures that give you a little bit more info. That makes sense. So we're going to do a rate control sprayer setup first. Yep, so we'll do that there. So then for search for spray tips, we have specific lookup. So that's usually more if you have a new to use sprayer but still old, came with some tips, and you want to see what they're good for, you can do specific tips. So you're only looking at that one tip, if that makes sense. But we're usually going to be doing just for search for spray tips. Scroll down, so we plug in our application rate. What are we doing for burn off? I keep forgetting to ask you questions. Are we doing 5 gallons an acre? Give it 5. Okay, there's 5, and you guys got stuff to do, so you guys probably go, what, 28, 29 mile an hour? Gotta get to the lake, right? No, what's more realistic for you guys?
7.
Sorry, 14? 14? Sure. And again, the nice thing is, tip pushing doesn't judge, so by all means, I deal, like legitimately, I deal with growers around the world, and I see everything. Some things that would probably make you cry in one way or the other, you know, that kind of stuff. So there's no shame in it, and especially when you're talking to me on the phone, I'm never trying to change anything as far as what you're doing, because you've got your own purpose for doing your application rate, you've got your own purpose for doing your application speeds and those kind of things. What I'm going to try and help you do, and just to make sure, is that we're doing what you're trying to do as effectively as we can, or take things into consideration that might come up or those kind of things. So. Yeah, and chances are you're going to be on 20-inch spacing, but again, there are some, and I've seen more and more 15-inch spacing machines coming across the board and those kind of things. But yeah, make sure you plug in your nozzle spacing. And for spray tip angle, generally we're going to be using 110-degree nozzles if we're on 20-inch spacing. The only time that you might, if you do have an older sprayer, you know, like some of the old pull types and those kind of things, because of the, you know, whether it's fixed boom or higher boom, then we might be using an 80-degree nozzle. So it's just for the overlap side of things. It's not one is better than the other, those kind of things. It's just what's fit for your machine. If that makes sense. The only time that you'd be using 80-degree nozzles on a self-propelled machine is if you're in a situation where your boom's always, you know, 40 inches above ground.
Yes. Yeah.
If that makes sense. Because again, we don't, with a 110-degree angle, you'll get more drift, just because it's wider, flat fan, those kind of things. 80-degree just helps it get lower down before she gets that overlap as well. So 110. So this last little bit here, so pretty much everything I put in so far is stuff you know about your sprayer, chances are, or hopefully you do. The last little bit here, if you can't see it, it says a target spray classification or droplet size. So this is the stuff where it gets a little bit more complicated. So we can either go down and search, hey, you know what, I checked my chemical label because it's good to do, and it says coarse or medium and those kind of things. But the difficulty is, you still get yourself in that same situation where, well, we'll select it. Then we scroll down, what tips do we get? Yeah, we get some coarse, but of course that's very close to medium, which might not be suitable, and then we get other ones that are maybe a little bit better. So like for an example, if we said, hey, this one, the only course we can get to is actually if we're going only 12 mile an hour, and our drift is kind of as high as it goes, you know, 15% in that case, which if you're using my tip or my cheat codes or you know, Lucas's rule of thumbs on the sheets or on the presentation and that kind of stuff, you get to the point where like, yeah, for bird off, I was trying to keep it under 10% drift. See, this is kind of where that stuff is really handy, because you get an idea of, hey, where should I start? Where's that bench line to start? If that makes sense, because otherwise you've probably got not much idea. Yeah, so we could probably scroll through that one, and from left to right, or I guess from the top down first. This is the DR series, 110 nozzle or 110-degree nozzle O2 size. There is a nozzle screen reference if you're using strainers. That doesn't mean you have to use it. Wilger strainers are actually really nice in the sense that they snap right into the tip. Handle is one piece. Probably, well, I probably reckon a little bit biased, but probably the nicest nozzle setup with strainers out there, if that makes sense. If you're so. Yep, so what it comes down to, it is at 14 mile an hour, which is the speed we put in, at around 56 psi. We're in the spray score, the coarse spray quality. So again, what that means is that, hey, am I following chemical label? Check. That's important. For legal purposes and those kind of things, yes, you want to do that. For the droplet size, this is that VMD or that droplet size that I was talking about. So we're aiming for around 400 microns. We got about 350. Probably not too bad. And the other thing to verify too is that these last two columns make sense for that balancing act. So where are we at for drift? 9%. Awesome. My aim was under 10%. We're in good space, right? And then for the coverage factor, if you look at the cheat codes, we'd be looking at trying to get over 80% coverage to make sure we have sufficient enough coverage for burn off the type application. That makes sense. Doesn't mean we're not going to shy away from higher percentages, because again, more coverage is generally better as long as drift is reasonable. But we're at 91%. So we're doing super, if that makes sense. We didn't have to look at it. We only had to look at the first two tips, if that makes sense. We don't have to look at a chart, cross-reference, those kind of things. With a rate controlled setup, it's a lot easier because you have limitations with speed and pressure and those kind of things, if that makes sense. With a pulse width sprayer though, if you have one of those systems, those sprayers, because you have a lot more flexibility in what the nozzles can physically do, and we're always going to be using an oversized nozzle that kind of taper down our flow rate with a duty cycle, it becomes a little bit more complicated. We might have 5 times the options that are feasible, if that makes sense. So that's why Tip Wizard is kind of very critical. For this rate control, just to finish off, we were pretty happy with that one there, because again, 56 PSI works, drift and coverage are good, check mark, or Lucas's check mark, all of that. Then we just to double check, we say, hey, what if I was using an old 2.5 instead? 14 mile an hour around 36 PSI? Is that going to give us enough room for pressure drop, or to lower our pressure and speed for our boundaries? If we're doing 3.5 mile an hour turns, those kind of things, or headlands, we're slowing down? Probably not. So I'd probably prefer myself, for sure, spraying around 60 PSI, we can slow down to, that 9.5 mile an hour before we're getting to the minimum pressure on our sprayer. That makes sense. So again, that's more for just for rate control guys. We'll just scroll up, we'll change it up a little bit, say, hey, same deal, but we're gonna do a pulse width. So whether this is, whether you got John Deere exact apply, case, there's so many of them now, ink command, see or do all and IntelliSpray and all those different things, they all function the same. Function in the same premise at the very least. The only thing different though is that we'll actually get you to plug in a maximum sprayer speed compared to like an average, if that makes sense, because we're going to want to make sure we pick the tip with a little bit of, well, there's always going to be some flexibility to slow down with the tip, with the reduced pulse width. We just want to make sure that we're not maxing out too quick. If we're going 60 mile an hour and a little bit of here or there, whatever that kind of stuff, we don't want to limit that. So we want to have an idea that, hey, at least our tip can go, we'll say in the same 14 mile an hour, just for our example. The other difference is it'll actually get you to pick which pulse width sprayer system you're using, if that makes sense. Even though the systems are using the same function, what ends up happening, the valve themselves have a little bit different specs. So there's a little bit more pressure drop with some, a little bit less with others, and those kind of things. So it's not that we're, like, Wilger's not collecting any of this information. We're not doing those kind of big things or whatever. But it actually does make a difference. So let's say we're using a case machine, casing, command, cool. All the rest of the stuff is the same. So what happens if we leave it as coarse? As a spray quality, it's not too bad. But we got smaller tips, a little bit of bigger tips, and a few options in between. So again, in this case, it wasn't too bad, but sometimes it's just like tons of options. So on a pulsing sprayer, things are going to be a little bit different. So the difficulty is we got a lot more options, and to rather than looking all the options in the face right off the get-go, we want to try filter them down a little bit. So the first thing though we want to do as step one is always size the tip. So make sure the size of the nozzle is suitable for the application speed and sprayer and those kind of things that we're doing. And to do that, we're actually going to ignore all this stuff, all the spray classification, all the droplet size and all that kind of stuff, because that doesn't matter yet. We want to make sure we pick the right size or the right color, if that makes sense, because that's function, if that makes sense. We don't want to have, there becomes issues with your nozzle being too small. That makes sense. It's too restrictive, we can only go 12 mile an hour when we wanted to go 14, those kind of situations. Or if our nozzle has turn compensation, when it gets to a turn, even though we slow down a little bit, we don't have any extra capacity on that nozzle. Actually, I'll kind of explain that. And, for anybody first time with pulse width sprayers this year? So like for turn compensation, what ends up happening, or even a pulsing sprayer, so maybe the guys that are thinking about the system, a really good system, but what ends up happening, they're going to be pulsing in pairs. So they have a little solenoid that's pulsing every 10th of a second, let's say. So every 10th of a second, that is spraying. What changes though is how long for that 10th of a second that is spraying for. So what we can end up doing, we get to the point where, yeah, let's say we have a 10-gallon equivalent nozzle, like for rate control. Because again, rate control, think of it like pulse width, but we're always tapped out, we're always maxed out at 100%. It's on all the time, we're not terminating anything, if that makes sense. But with pulse width, what ends up happening is that, yeah, let's say we have a 10-gallon nozzle, great size for rate control, but we want to use it for 7.5-gallon in crowd work. All we're going to do is say, hey, if you're pulsing for that 10th of a second, only spray for 75% of that 10th of a second. And then the other quarter of it, it's off. That makes sense? So the 10-gallon nozzle, if it was on all the time, 10 gallons. If it's only on 3/4 of the time, yeah, she's 7.5 gallons, 3/4 rate. And then same deal for 5 gallons an acre, 50%. There's limitations. We don't want to be going lower than 50% because again, you get to the point where, let's say in an extreme case, our duty cycle is only 25%. So again, the nozzles are pulsing in pairs, because again, you want to make sure you get kind of overlap and those kind of things as you're moving through. But if this one's spraying 25% of the time, and then it's buddy spraying in the off cycle 25%, how long is your sprayer actually spraying for? Well, 25 plus 25. Oh, shoot, we're only spraying half the time. And if your duty cycle is going to be very low, then that's a situation where you might see, physical skips in coverage if you're doing it at a decent speed. Or a lot of the time, that's where you're doing your boundaries, and you see, on the outer wing, you see that yellow green pattern in the grass. Again, grass is a lot higher, so depending on blue light, you might naturally do that too. But that's kind of what you're seeing. If that makes sense. So we want to avoid that. So it's just a sizing issue. Nothing wrong with your sprayer. Your sprayer's working fine. But it gets to the point where we've skipped that first step. So what we end up doing, we look at the pressure. We get the speed range. So we get with the pulsing sprayer, you get a speed range, not just a speed. And the duty cycle. So the duty cycle, usually we want to try to keep our duty cycle between 60 and 80%, so that we have a little bit extra room on the top side of that nozzle capacity. That's for turn comp, or like, hey, you know what, it's a nice day, and I got pancake field ahead of me, and I just, buckle down, and I go, oh, okay, and, oh, geez, I'm going fast, okay. You didn't underrate yourself or anything like that. Does that make sense? So you got that capacity, but also too, on the lower side of the capacity, because usually we're slowing down more often than we're speeding up. Does that make sense? The lower side is that, hey, when we're approaching that quarter, or we're doing a headlands at 8.5, whatever mile an hour, we're still doing the same rate. And the biggest factor in the pulse width systems, what would happen if you're slowing down to do your headlands or whatever on rate control springs? Well, your pressure's going down, naturally, because it has to. Because again, pump's working harder, I'm going slower, so to keep the rate the same, because rate's king, we gotta keep rate the same. I gotta drop my pressure. With the pulsing system, a little bit different. If I'm going faster, what ends up happening? Oh, I just opened my nozzle, my solenoid longer. I can keep the same pressure, same coverage. If I'm going faster, oh, I gotta go slower now. Okay, cool. Do I have to change my pressure? No, the duty cycle just drops. So your coverage, whether you're doing your headlands or that kind of stuff, you're not losing that coverage in those intermittent parts, your dirty corners and those kind of things that do so. So that's, again, just those rule of thumbs for the duty cycle. That's kind of where we're talking in these first few columns. So let's say in our situation, we're spraying at 40 PSI. To read this here, if you can't see it in the back, so it says we can travel from 4.3 to 17 mile an hour. You might say, oh, I wanted to go 14 mile an hour. But that upper end, that's 17, that's that turn comp. Because again, if you're slowing down to 7 or 8 mile an hour, let's say, what's happening here? Something happening? Are we the same over the entire boot? Oh yeah. Over here, we're going backwards, we're stopped, and those can hopefully section controls after that. But over here, we're going 3 times the speed, 4 times the speed. So what we end up getting is that extra capacity, or that outside wind can go 17 mile an hour before we run out of flow. A lot of the time, when you're talking, hey, travel speed 8.5 mile an hour, how fast is my outer boom going? Even if you set yourself up to 24 mile an hour or 20 mile an hour, that's pretty healthy. We're going to be doing a huge, much better job with those tips than before, like on a rate control sprayer. If that makes sense. So, but we don't want to go crazy. Because usually if we see numbers like this, the upper maximum speed ranges for our tips of like 30 mile an hour, 40 mile an hour, that usually means, yeah, your duty cycle's got issues. We didn't pick the right size, naturally. So, so in this situation, and then once you get up to 100% duty cycle, you're capped out. You can't go any higher. The tips, it's tapped out. So in this situation, if we're spraying, hey, at 40 PSI, 81% duty cycle, did we check the duty cycle? Yep, we're good, sweet. And then once we've sized it, now we can look at the cool stuff. The droplet size and those kind of things, make sure we follow kept the label. And then for drift side of things, we're 40%. or sorry, 40 PSI, we're about 14% drift. We're like, oh geez, actually Lucas was trying to keep our drift under 10% for burn off. Well, screwed up somewhere. So all we end up doing is we just flip to the next series. All right, so what we'll scroll down. So this is the SR series. So this is one of the first series, the drift reduction tips. So we go to the NMR, so 40 PSI. Just for example, our duty cycle is the same, so we know what size, right? Our spray droplet size is getting closer to 400 microns. Our drift is 8%. And our coverage factor for systemic stuff, we want to try and keep it around 80%. So we're at 90% burn. That makes sense. Perfect burn off tip. As far as another option, again, just because it's up here and I have stuff, you could do something like a DR series, but what ends up happening, because we have free control of that pressure on a pulse width sprayer, we hit a button in the cap, we can change our pressure to whatever we want. That makes sense. So definitely, if you haven't been, it gets to the point where if you're spraying nominally at 50 PSI for an application, always have your secondary pressure down to your minimum, so that, hey, I'm doing my head-ons, and I gotta watch myself a little bit, flick the pressure, or flick the button, see if it's down to 35 PSI. We cut our drift down significantly. And that's the other thing that's got a nice tip wizard here is that if we do something like that, so in this situation, if we had the same size, and we're spraying at 60 PSI for burn off, we can go upwards of 20 mile an hour. So our duty cycle, everything's good, we're size still. We're still in coarse spray, just kind of teetering between coarse and very coarse, which again, for burn off, not so bad. We're 6% drift flow, quite low drift. And our coverage factor, are we over 80%? Yep, we're 86%. So in this situation, what ends up happening, this is going to be a lot more flexible tip for drift reduction. Does that make sense? So the reason being is that, hey, we can drop our pressure on a whip and go down to 35 PSI. And our drift goes down from 6% to 4% at a cost of 8-9% coverage. But for those situations that we need to reduce our drift, we can do that. And then some. Does that make sense? The difficulty is when you're talking the drift factor, you know, a lot of the time, kind of like I said, once you start reducing it down, trying to get really, really low, you do get to the point where, yeah, you know, for every 1% drift we're saving, we're giving up like 4% coverage. And it starts to get even more stark than that. So for like 1% drift, is it worthwhile to give up 10% coverage? Yeah, probably not, if that makes sense. So anyway, so that's tip of it in a nutshell. Yeah, so between those tips, I'd probably be easier saying, hey, if I want a tip that's going to be able to do my burn off application and then do a little bit finer coverage, where I can bump up my pressure, get finer spray, you know, for some in-crop or some axial or wild oat control or something like that. Cool. That MR 103 might be the option for you. If you're in a situation where you're more drift sensitive, and it does provide you a benefit to have, you know, that drift reduction mode, call it that, then yeah, you can drop your pressure down and do a lot less drift with the DR 103. That kind of makes sense so far? Actually, how are you doing on time? I'm probably already over, aren't I?
No, we still have 15 minutes for you.
Oh, geez. Well, you know what? I had a few coffees this morning, so you might have noticed I know part-time auctioneer, but I've been told I should maybe, you know, or at least, but I get the face for radio too, so yeah, it's kind of one of those. But, so, you know what, then if you've got a little bit of time, I'll do one in-crop application. Say, what are we doing for your in-crop Liberty? Are you guys doing 7.5, or are you doing 10? 10? Okay, cool. And actually, if we get a little bit of time, so usually one of the bigger questions, actually I'll kind of answer a few questions here. Just commonly asked questions, because usually I forget to. Common questions I get, how long do the tips last? I say use them like Kleenex, you use them once, toss them, get a new set. No, our tips actually last a very long time. It gets to the point where the only factor though that's difficult is that it's a loaded question because water quality makes a huge difference. What you're putting through it makes a huge difference. You know, if you're talking granulars and this and that, and those kind of things. Fall on a suppression, guess what? You're putting your shot peening, you know, those kind of things make a big difference. But generally with our tips, usually what I'll end up doing is that once you're brand new, unless you have some issues like the guy who had thesis that, you know, crystallized or something like that, unless you got something, which isn't really a tip thing, it's more, you know, residue or that. Usually what I'd say is, because we got stuff to do, and we can't, like, it's easy enough for me to say, hey, yeah, every year go test your nozzles, go check everyone, make sure the flow's right. Okay, I got stuff to do. That's not going to be the reality, but I'd say, hey, in the first 2 years, don't worry about it. They're going to be more than fine. Unless you're doing 200,000 acres in those 2 years, like Cody might be, or something like that. But water quality makes a big difference. So in that, you know, in that third year, I might say test a few on each section. See where your wear rate is, because usually when that nozzle's out 10%, that's the time it's replaced. That doesn't